Hi, everyone. I'm Tyler Sticka. I co-own a web design and development agency called Cloud4, where we like to organize a lot of our experience design projects into what we call responsive sprints. And those involve a lot of different artifacts and activities, ranging from sort of collaborative ideation sessions and exercises to wireframes and sketches and more static explorations, and our real bread and butter, which are interactive, rapid prototypes, often of complex web applications or experiences, things that you can't just, install a WordPress theme to accomplish. And along the way, we use a lot of tools that you are probably familiar with, or you've encountered one way or another, or you've heard of if you are a designer or you work with designers. But the sort of tools that we think kind of set us apart the most is our reliance on designing in the browser using web standards. Now, I could give an entire talk on all the things that I love about designing in the browser, and if you're interested in that, I've written a few articles, but I'm going to save you all some time. I'm just going to say it's awesome for a lot of different reasons, and we can table that for further discussion later if you want. Um, but when we design in the browser, the sort of classic web standards, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript have their sort of tried and true domains. So HTML is generally representing our content, CSS generally representing design, and JavaScript representing behavior. But these things weren't designed primarily as like a tool for rapid prototyping. So we need to add a few ergonomics along the way to save us some time, make sure that we are uh, not wasting time like copying and pasting HTML over and over, things like that, which is where a tool like Eleventy comes in, or I guess I should start saying now, build awesome. But I'm sorry, Zach, I'm gonna slip up. It's been, old habits die hard, so I will do my best. So we use Eleventy for ergonomics. Now, shifting the focus to the HTML for a second, I've labeled it here as the domain of content, and that brings up the question, what content? Now, any designers on the call know that when it comes to sourcing content for our mockups or our wireframes or whatever, it can get a little complicated. Now, ideally, you'll be designing with real content, right? That's you know, the best way to make sure that what you're designing is actually going to function. But it's not always available. Sometimes because of scheduling reasons, sometimes because you're designing something that relies primarily on user-generated content. There may be other reasons. In that case, sometimes designers will get real creative, put on their writing hat and author some bespoke placeholders. So just writing the content out themselves as needed, but can obviously be painfully slow, especially if writing is not your forte, not your focus area, or if you're designing something in a language that you don't speak regularly. There's a lot of different reasons why that's slow. More recently, a lot of folks would probably reach to an AI or LLM to, or as two synonyms, but some generative tool to stub out the content. But that can, have costs associated with it. If you are just wanting to use it a little bit, it can there can be a lot of back and forth nitpicking what it generates. And then if you want to use a lot of it, it can be overeager. And all of a sudden you are having to kind of tear down this mountain of generated content rather than just sprinkling it in as needed. And of course, there is the tried and true design staple, which is lorem ipsum or some lorem ipsum-like service. But it's tedious to copy and paste from those, and the content is usually pretty generic. It's hard to, use like lorem ipsum for a first name and last name, for example. But let's poke at this one a little bit. What if this option were a little faster and a little less generic? In that case, it could actually come in handy, right? Because it doesn't have the costs or the back and forth associated with it. There's no, waiting or scheduling. There's no writing stuff by hand. And that sounds like a bit of ergonomics, which means that it's probably something we should add to our sort of prototyping platform or our little static website that we use to prototype these things. So my favorite tool for this is Eleventy's shortcodes or build awesome shortcodes. It's going to take me forever. It's going to be like when the year changes over and I'm writing 2025 for like months. But So shortcodes let us define little custom tags that we can use in multiple template languages. That's especially nice if you aren't always sure which template language you're going to adopt or if your design team has different preferences. And so in this talk, I'm going to walk through building three little shortcode helpers and walking you through it so that you can adapt it to your needs or use it as a springboard for something that makes sense for your own work. Um, by the end of this, we'll have made little shortcode helpers for outputting bits of dummy text content, placeholder images, and even placeholder iconography. So let's start with that first one. Let's make a helper for text, numbers, etc., text-based content. For this, we're going to leverage a dependency, and we're going to use a library called Chance. Chance is a JavaScript library that generates random stuff. These are all the little methods that it has for generating names, locations, timestamps, payment details, etc. It all happens locally, and it can really come in handy. The way it works is that you have a Chance instance, and that instance has a number of methods. And those methods can work with or without options. So in this case, if you call the Chance name method, you'll get back a name. If you say, I would like that with the middle name, it'll spit back a name with the middle name included. So let's actually make our helper. We'll start by installing the Chance dependency. Then I'm going to put our helpers into their own files just to keep things organized, but you could also drop them into the Eleventy config file if you want. And so in this case, in our helper file, we're going to import the Chance library. We're going to create a little placeholder for the Chance instance. We'll create that the first time we use the helper, but there's no real reason to create it beforehand. Going to go ahead and set up our function. So the way the shortcode is going to work is it's going to accept a method as the first argument. So that's the thing we want to generate based on the Chance library's available methods. So a name or a first name or a date or something like that. And then a multiple amount of arguments. Most Chance methods just accept that one object, but some accept some additional arguments. We want to support that. I'm going to use a little trick here that I use to make sure Liquid templates can play in the same playground as other templating languages by checking if that first argument is a string, and if it is, parsing it as JSON. Liquid doesn't allow you to use objects, JavaScript objects directly as arguments. So this lets you pass along a JSON string instead, and you can still get all the full bells and whistles, which is a nice bit of, again, ergonomics for when you're rapid prototyping. Don't want to have to think about converting an object to something else. So if this is our first time using the library, we go ahead and instantiate our Chance library. If you want to get real fancy, you can pass along like custom seeds and things like that. I've never done that. You can refer to the docs, but that's something you would do here if you wanted to. We go ahead and check if the method is a function. And if it is, we pass along our arguments. And if it's not, we log a error to the console and we just return an empty string. We do this because when you're rapid prototyping, you don't want to have to stop and debug your build process. You just want to see what went wrong and then, fix the typo in your method name or whatever. So this kind of keeps us from disrupting that. That's all of our helper function. So you can go ahead and jump to your Eleventy config, add the shortcode. You can name it whatever you want. I'm just going to name it Chance. And from there in our templates, we can sprinkle in little Chance shortcodes, sort of like Mad Libs. We can kind of put them in where we want a little bit of content, and it'll replace all those with something completely random, like just, pulling something out of my hat. It might say, hello, my name is Tyler Sticka. I work for Cloud4 in the great state of Oregon. Just as an example, again, totally random. There is a shortcoming, though, which is that we can't use this to assign a random value to a variable or put it inside of like a loop or an if statement. If we try to use a shortcode in this way, it's going to fail. But we can use filters in this way. Eleventy also supports universal filters. And thankfully, we can pretty much use the same function as is. So we can go ahead and, in our Eleventy config, also add a filter called Chance. So in this example, I'm using that to set a random Boolean, basically a coin toss, to a variable called isOnline. And I'm going to loop over that and output difference in text, depending on if that's true or not. And we can also pass along arguments and options. So if I want to change the likelihood of that Boolean to be less of a coin toss, I can do that from here too. So we can use this library in two different ways. I'll be doubling back to how all these things work in the context of a prototype, but for now, that's pretty much all our text and number helpers handled with one little shortcode and filter. So let's move on to something more visual. Let's move on to images. For this, I'm going to use another library. This one I wrote. It's a simple SVG placeholder library. Generates very simple little small rectangles with optional text and color information. So the way this works is you have a function call, accepts an object with whatever options you want. That spits out a data string, so a data URL. It's not actually base64 encoded because you don't need to do that for text, and SVGs are just text. So very small, very fast. You can plop that into any old image element, and it will display as an image. So we'll go ahead and install that dependency, create a new FPO image file. By the way, if anyone's typing very rapidly, I will be sharing these code samples later. So save your fingies. This is just for funsies that we're walking through this all. After we've imported that, this is optional, but I like to set some default options. It's not that I dislike the default grays. I made them after all, but I find that when we are working on a project, oftentimes there's like a certain brand that we want to align with just to make the images feel a little bit more at home. So I find it helpful just to define for the project, here's like my default background and text color, things like that. For the shortcode function itself, I could just do sort of like we do with chance and always, just rely on that options argument. But 99% of the time, I find that I'm just wanting to set the width and height. So I'm going to break those out as their own options. For that last argument, we're going to use the same trick as before and parse it as JSON if it's a string. And from there, it's just a matter of merging our defaults, our width and height, and all the other options into one little object, which we're using destructuring here. Again, I won't be going into what that is, but it's very useful. And returning the result of whatever the simple SVG placeholder function spits out. So in our Eleventy config, we go ahead and add that shortcode. I don't find it necessary to do a filter version of this, so we're just going to stick to the shortcode. And now we can plop in FPO image, whatever size we want, wherever we want, and it will go ahead and display a little placeholder image. And if we want to, we can also customize that just like we could our previous example based on the options that that library supports. So in this case, I'm just using an emoji instead of the size and customizing the background color. That brings us to our third and final shortcode for this talk, which is iconography. Now, it's common in our interactive wireframes to need little affordances, and we may not always have time to make these from scratch, right? I mean, maybe you have some icons already, or maybe you already have an approved library, in which case there is a great third-party plugin that by Uncenter that will let you point at a directory of icons or even like an npm package of icons. It has support for a few open source libraries. So if you already know what you want or you already have a library, you could use something like that. I know like Font Awesome has a icon component. There are lots of examples, but what if you're rapid prototyping and you're in early stages, you don't necessarily want to have to stop and think about brand design and visual design when all you really need is a search magnifying glass or an arrow or something like that. So when that's the case, we're going to make our helper leverage a project called Iconify, which is an open source directory of normalized icons from all the various open source icon projects. And they have an API, so we can fetch icons on demand using a string and then inline them in our prototypes. And we can even cache the result, so it's not having to go out externally every single time. For this, we're actually not going to. Iconify has some npm packages, and they're pretty cool, but they also tend to rely on you installing whatever icons you may want to use, and we don't really want to install tens of thousands of icons as dependencies. So instead, we're going to use the Eleventy fetch plugin to kind of streamline fetching the icon data on demand. For our helper, which we're going to call Iconify, we're going to import that plugin, and then we're going to save a few values that will come in handy throughout the rest of this helper. So we're going to save like the API URL. A fun fact is Iconify actually, it's pretty easy to self-host the API. So if you're not cool with having an external dependency, you could deploy your own endpoint and have the same functionality. So that's pretty cool. But for now, we're just going to use the Iconify one. I'm going to save some common options for my fetch calls. All of the responses are going to be JSON, so we can just set the type. But I'm also going to set a duration that's pretty generous of 1 year. You know, it's cool that the Iconify service is free. I don't want to hit it up more often than I need to. And it's not like the icon designs are going to change that frequently. And I probably don't want them to, right? I probably, if I'm embedding an icon and I'm sharing it with a client, I probably don't want it to become a different icon at a moment's notice. So keeping a nice, generous cache is cool. We're also going to save a few attributes that we want to add to the inline SVG. The class is just a little bit of ergonomics, so we can style the SVGs easily. The XML namespace, not strictly required for inline SVGs in HTML, but I like to keep it there just in case you end up doing something kind of odd, like if you have CSS set up as a template type and you want to use this to inline icons or something like that. So, you know, better safe than sorry. We're going to create a couple of helper functions as well, just so our helper, our main shortcode function is nice and clean. So we'll start with a function that I'm going to call getSpecificIcon. What I mean by that is when you reference icons in Iconify, there's the icon set and then there's the name. But if you have to look up that specific name for every icon you embed, it sort of defeats the purpose of saving you time. You could have just found the icon library and installed it. So, but at the same time, we want to support that if there is a very specific icon you want to use. So this function is basically going to take whatever string we give it, and it's going to check if it's specific already. And it's going to do that in a real lazy way, which is, does it include a colon? And if so, assume it's specific already, don't do anything. But if it's not, we're actually going to use Iconify's search endpoint to search for the string with one result, fetch the data, and if any results come back, we go ahead and return that. The results are going to be the specific names with the set and the icon name. And if not, we'll go ahead and throw an error saying that we couldn't find an icon for that result. And one more little helper function we're going to make is we're going to make a function that will convert a JavaScript object to an HTML attribute string. This will just make it easier to output our little inline SVG from the icon data we get back. With all that in place, we're now ready to actually make the icon helper. We're going to accept a string and then an optional object of attributes, which we're going to parse with JSON, again, just so our liquid friends can join the party. We're going to put everything in this helper in a try catch statement. This will help us gracefully handle errors. It's always a good idea when you are relying on an external API or service. So go ahead and use that first helper function we made to get the specific icon from whatever string we grabbed. And if there's an error, our try catch statement will handle that, which is why we're not really worrying about it right now. Then we're going to do something that sounds painful, but is totally fine, which is we're going to split the icon name by its colon. I do not envy the icon name in this case, but that's going to get us the name of the set and then the icon name, which we'll need to build the API call that fetches the icon data. If what we get back is not an object, we're going to go ahead and throw an error, which again we'll catch gracefully since we're in a try statement. And if we did get something back, we'll go ahead and grab the width, height, and body of the icon from the data that was returned. We'll build our little attribute string for the SVG based on those defaults that we set earlier. A few properties that we can build from the data we got back. That data-icon attribute, that's optional, but I like to have it because I like to, peek into the prototype. If I put in a general string and I'm like, I actually like that icon. What set is that from? It lets me see, what did Iconify actually come back with, which can be helpful for reference later. And then we go ahead and smash in any attributes the user may have passed along to the shortcode if they wanted to customize that. And that gives us everything we need to create a little inline SVG string. And if at any point in this process, either in one of those helper functions or in this function, we encountered an error, just like in our chance shortcode, we're going to log that so the author knows what happened. We're going to go ahead and return an empty string. Again, just kind of keep the build process alive and moving, and don't punish someone for typos, or more often, don't punish them for searching for an icon that there's no result for. From there, this should look pretty familiar, but we now have everything we need to import the helper, add a shortcode for it. And now in our prototypes, we can just embed an icon. So in this case, the first result for dog. If we want to embed a specific icon, we can go ahead and add the, copy pastable value from the iconify directory. And we can also customize the properties on that output if we want to do something different, like adjust the class name, add an inline style, or some other attribute. So with our three helpers in place, I'm going to show a quick example of putting all this together. How does all this work while we're actually prototyping? So for this example, I've got kind of like a minimal messaging interface with a few different features, and I've got some lightly styled markup. But if you were to show this to a client or stakeholder, or to get a sense of, will this work? Try it on your phone, all the things that designing in browser is good for, it wouldn't be very useful, right? First of all, we at the very least want to loop over this element, and that helps a little bit, gives us something scrollable. But now let's go ahead and use our helpers to make this feel, more real. And so we'll start by replacing that image placeholder with an image element with our little FPO image shortcode. We can go ahead and use some chance functions to plop in the name and username, which is going to change per element. And yes, Chance's method name for that username is very regrettable in my opinion, but we'll forgive it because it's useful. Then we're going to go ahead and output a timestamp. I have some quibbles with Chance's timestamp functions, which you can see here by the fact that I'm having to pad the minute value, but not too bad. And we could always make this into like a macro or something, or write a new helper if we wanted to. We'll use the paragraph method to stub in a message. If I want to get real fancy, I could also use Chance's integer method to vary the number of sentences, or loop over a random number of paragraphs, but we'll keep this simple for now. When it comes to this little reaction section down here, Chance does have an emoji method, but I don't really like it because it just picks anything in the emoji Unicode range, which doesn't really feel, like an organic set of reactions. So instead, I'm going to create a little array of the possible reactions, and we use Chance's pick set method to pick two at random, which we can then loop over along with a random integer representing the number of reactions. And again, you could make this even more complex if you wanted to by looping over, picking a random number, something like that, but we'll keep it simple for now. And lastly, let's replace that, plus character with a icon. In this case, I'm just searching for the first one for reaction outline, and it's just going to plop out a outline reaction icon. And lastly, for that reply button, we'll go ahead and use the first chat outline icon and then a random number. And to make this extra easy on myself, I'm starting that random number at 2, so I don't have to do anything crazy with reply versus replies. And that gives us a scrollable list of messages that, while not perfect, this is obviously still placeholder content. It's more than enough for us to be able to refine our design, evaluate, decide if this is worth carrying forward, at which point maybe we'll add in some of those bells and whistles to get a better idea of where the breakpoints are, and what sort of things we still have to change and fix and adjust, which is kind of the whole point. So I just went through a lot of stuff. As we end our time together this morning, I do want to pause and make a small confession. Earlier, I said that these were my 3 favorite helpers, but that's not always true. Depending on the project, there may be much different sort of content needs and focus areas that we encounter, hurdles, bits of inefficiency that we want to solve throughout. And that does vary project to project. Some projects vary so much that it even kind of throws into question some of these delineations and pros and cons from earlier. And sometimes if what we're prototyping is highly transactional or visual and doesn't really have a ton of text content, we may even just throw in something like the flow or redacted typefaces, which just you could put on any old text and it'll just make them into dashes or lines or squiggles. And the reason it varies so much is because when it comes to projects, customers, or most of all, our audience, uh, the idea of one size fits all or an actual tangible average is a complete myth. And that may be surprising if you've listened to a lot of pundits and tech folks who seem to love to suggest wherever they can that web experiences are a solved problem. And that's a take that I frankly am baffled by when you look at the ever worsening performance landscape, the millions of unaddressed accessibility issues that persist on all our homepages, and the fact that even a layperson, someone who doesn't know their HTML from their JavaScript, can tell you that the average web experience is justifiably a punchline these days. So is the web a solved problem, or is it that it's chock full of problems to solve? If we want to build a better web, we need to escape the rut that we're in. And that involves becoming better advocates for our audience. And to be more effective advocates for our audience, we need to own our process enough to improve it and to shorten the distance between us and our users, to stop settling for throwing mockups over a wall or counting on something to spit back at us whatever the best practices of 2015 might have looked like. Now, what owning our process looks like is going to be different for all of us. We aren't all in the position to be able to make big, sweeping process changes, but that's okay. Starting small can help. Maybe as small as whipping up a handful of little helpers to streamline your design process. If you need any help or just want to share your progress, you know where to find me. Thank you all so much for your time today.